Well, welcome everyone. Congratulations for making it here under the current heat dome that is spreading across Europe. But sometimes, what better relief from the oppressive heat that we're experiencing at the moment than to come to a nice, air-conditioned movie theater and hear about cinema and watch some very amazing films, which is what we'll have on the program tonight. We'll be hearing from, well, we have the very great pleasure to be hearing from Jessica Gordon-Burroughs tonight, to be talking to us on the topic of diasporic aesthetics, intermedial dialogues, the films of Nicolás Guillén Landrián, a Cuban filmmaker whose films we'll be watching after Jessica's lecture. We have, I think, 4 or 5 films on the program tonight, so a suite of short films. And of course, as is our practice here at Lecture and Film, we'll be joining Jessica after the screening for a Q&A. So do stick around for that. We can talk about the films. But this is really, I mean, these are films that have been kind of restored and are kind of like, I guess, finding a new profile, a new public, new audience, a new reception after many decades of obscurity. And Jessica has played a key role in the reemergence of Landrián's films. She herself is a lecturer in Latin American Studies and Visual Culture in the Department of European Languages and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh, having received her PhD from Columbia University in the United States. Jessica works across academia as well as archives and curating in both the kind of art and film worlds, and has a particular focus on Latin American Caribbean cinema. And so obviously Landrián's work is very key to her research in general. She is currently at work on a book project titled Foreign Elements, Latin American Cinematic Experiments in Displacement. But today she'll be talking to us about Landrián, so I will now welcome Jessica up to the lectern to tell us all about this fascinating filmmaker.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I wanted to thank the curators of the Black Atlantic Film Series for the generous invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. So what I'm going to present is part of research originally published in French and Spanish with the review Cinéma d'Amérique latine in Toulouse. And it's going to be expanded, published in expanded form soon in English, in a special issue dedicated to communities and archives. And these are films I'm very passionate about, so I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all about them after the end of the screening. I'm going to focus my intervention on the last and only audiovisual work produced in Miami by the Cuban filmmaker Nicolás Guillén Landrián. So this film will be, this video, we'll be screening it at the end of the film program today. And the documentary is called Inside Downtown. And it's been the main focus of my critical work on the filmmaker. And Inside Downtown was a collaboration with Jorge Uzquiza Zorrilla, a then young Cuban filmmaker, who later also completed an intimate portrait of Guillén Landrián's last days in Miami. And that work was called Nicolás, El fin pero no es el fin, the end but not the end. And both works were part of the restoration project, Decolonizing the Archive, Restoration of Inside Downtown, and The End but Not the End of the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, which I'll expand on later. And the restoration implied myriad international partners with diverse, effective investments in the project. These partners were scattered across Latin America, Europe, and North America, each forming a complex constellation of transnational and intergenerational solidarity. So Inside Downtown is one of 20 moving image works directed by Guillén Landrián. He was born in 1938 in Camagüey, in Cuba, and he was the nephew of Nicolás Guillén, who was the poet laureate of revolutionary Cuba. Guillén Landrián trained with filmmakers such as Joris Ivens and Theodor Christensen. And in its first decade, he was one of the few Afro-Cuban directors active at the Cuban National Film Institute, or the Instituto Cubano del Arte e Industrias Cinematográficos, which is better known as the ICAIC. So from 1962 to 1972, Guillén Landrián filmed several documentaries now esteemed key in the Cuban film canon. In 1972, he was censored and expelled from the ICAIC, and he left for Miami in 1989, remaining there until his death in 2003. His cinematic oeuvre remained in relative obscurity until the early 2000s, when pirated copies of his films began to circulate, forming a national and extraterritorial community joined around his figure. Within this groundswell, a new generation of Cuban filmmakers, spectators, and critics embraced the filmmaker's work as an alternative lineage within ICAIC production. His figure reconfigured what has been understood as the Cuban revolutionary canon of the 1960s and early 1970s, usually including filmmakers such as Tomás Gutiérrez de Lea, Julio García Espinosa, Humberto Solás, and of course the newsreel documentarian Santiago Álvarez. However, contrary to the work of Guillén Landrián, even Álvarez, who was known for his searing racial critique, looked abroad rather than at Cuba itself in its efforts to decolonize consciousness. This, among other factors, leads us back to the institutional axes of canonization, but also to its racialized tensions. So many of the voices who participated in the critical reconsideration of his work can be found in the anthology Guillén Landrián o el desconcierto fílmico, in English, Guillén Landrián or Filmic Confusion. So it's from 2019. It was co-edited by Julio Ramos and Dylan Robbins. With essays by researchers central to the filmmaker's exhumation, this valuable anthology provides a rhizomatic cartography in which a future generation of critics will surely find a new way of approaching the Cuban cinematic canon. So a thought-provoking, in-depth analysis of Guillén Landrián's artistic project and cinematic project, the anthology focuses on the filmmaker's cinematic work produced between 1962 and 1972 at the ICAIC. My contribution to the anthology is the only chapter in the volume that is dedicated to Inside Downtown, the filmmaker's single moving image work produced outside Cuba. This detail points to the persistent difficulties of making visible or legible Latin American cinematic works produced outside national production systems, but it also derives from the gaps, displacements, and changes in media, infrastructure, creative possibilities, and the communities that inevitably accompany diasporic production, and which often conceal unexpected continuities in the trajectory of an artist. A work like Inside Downtown that could easily seem like an anomaly of late style, on the contrary, instead makes possible the construction of a longer arc in relation to Guillén Landrián's moving image production that joins with his artistic oeuvre. If in previous critical work I've explored the digital activation of Inside Downtown from different angles, especially in relation to his racialized identity, this work includes the essay in the Ramos and Robbins anthology that I mentioned, but also another essay with Cinema Journal. And I'm happy to speak more about that during the Q&A if that's of interest. The following talk is instead an attempt to approach Inside Downtown from a new vantage point, in this case, the connection between Guillén Landrián's work as a painter and his cinematic oeuvre. This intermedial dialogue, to borrow a concept from Marian Schmidt's wonderful book on the French New Wave, on the one hand, allows continuity to be made visible, where critics have previously perceived an enduring silence in the filmmaker's cinematic work. And on the other hand, I will argue that this encounter between cinema and painting also acts as a conceptual space to consider the temporal intervention implied by restoration as a collective and individual ritual. As such, the restoration of Guillén Landrián's work is both a generational and intergenerational project that traverses media and joins both painting and film as creative spaces. When Inside Downtown was completed in 2001, just before Guillén Landrián's death, it had been 30 years since he had made a film. Even after its completion, and despite winning a special mention at the 19th International Film Festival of Uruguay, the documentary initially was barely seen beyond 2 initial public screenings in Miami, affiliated with Miami-Dade, along with private viewings in Guillén Landrián's home with friends. In the interim, Inside Downtown circulated almost exclusively in low resolution on streaming platforms. YouTube was precisely my first approach to the work now over 10 years ago. As such, the restoration of this sole digital work represents an important milestone in the life cycle of this final cinematic work. Lasting just over 30 minutes, Inside Downtown was recorded with Egusquiza in 1999 over a period of 4 days and edited in off hours 2 years later at Village Films, a production company in Miami, where Egusquiza then worked. Though directed by Guillén Landrián, both Egusquiza and Guillén Landrián worked together to edit the documentary, along with 2 other editors. Egusquiza acted as a translator of the new digital technology, which the editing process implied. And you can hear more about this in, this is a podcast I co-produced with Nicolaus Pernesky for the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive podcast series. So consisting of a series of interviews, mainly with artists from Guillén Landrián's generation, who lived in exile for different reasons in Miami, Inside Downtown also portrays street life and limited routes of the Metro Mover, one of the sole means of public transportation in a seemingly hostile city dominated by cars. This late capitalist city marginalizes and encloses the interviewed artists within an almost claustrophobic dynamic of the artists' domestic spaces, their workshops, and their own creative process. So I'm going to play a brief clip with the beginning of Inside Downtown and also the end. And the final clip, or the second clip, is Guillén Landrián in his home studio debating with his son to give you a sense of the work's texture and its rhythm. Okay, so in Inside Downtown, the artist studio, which is the main topic of the work, it's understood as a liminal metaphysical threshold, a refuge that represents a form of resistance, a bastion against the ever-encroaching financial center. The workshop also acts as a stage for the performance that transforms the body and the artist's experience into a work of art. And here I'm drawing from Ivana Blaswick's research on the artist studio. In Inside Downtown, each of the interviewees, in total there are 7, is recorded in these interiors that are equipped with the props typical of these artist professions. Poetry books in the case of Esteban Luis Cárdenas, painting, sculpture, Tony Lopez. And in the case of the filmmaker's widow and creative partner, Greta Alfonso, she's portraying the gift shop where she worked. So outside of the corporate circuits of art, in Inside Downtown, the house and the studio are sometimes the same entity. This is the case for the painter Julio Pichon. At night, his studio is transformed into a room with a simple mattress spread on the floor, with his paintings even stored in the kitchen. This is where I sleep, where I paint, where I live, declares Pichon, with characteristic humor. Someone has to notify the Ministry of Education, he says, knowing full well that this entity does not exist in Miami, and especially not in relation to his tiny studio. I don't fit in here, he shouts to the camera, almost jubilantly, embracing the multiple meanings of the statement. In the gift shop where Alfonso works, as in much of the documentary in different ways, a persistent sense of human connection struggles against the atomization of the capitalist sphere. Egusquiza's lens captures an effective charge that weakens the logic of consumption and financial exchange that at first glance provides the conditions of existence of the premises. The glass of the store's display case in turn reflects and refracts the figures of Alfonso and Guillén Landrián. We are inside and outside the logic of consumption. Despite the limited research that has been conducted on Inside Downtown, these complex ambiguities make it a crucial work in the filmmaker's oeuvre, and also within the Cuban diasporic canon. Inside Downtown, for me, expresses the transformations, but also continuities in Guillén Landrián's oeuvre and his sense of being. In permanent evolution over the years, the filmmaker never abandoned his passion for the creative practice of the artist as a dissident subject against any monolithic power, whether the states or the corporate city. So 2020 was a key year for the legacy of Guillén Landrián, and in a sense it represented a change of destiny. That year, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, after 2 decades of lobbying by diverse critics, artists, and filmmakers, the ICAIC approved a Cuban restoration of the complete celluloid works of Guillén Landrián from the 1960s and 1970s. Joining broader international initiatives to decolonize the archive, the restoration team was led by Cuban filmmaker Ernesto Duranas. In the same period, Guillén Landrián's collaborator in Inside Downtown, Jorge Uzquiza, found what we might call a second-generation Betacam of Inside Downtown and a master of El Fin pero no se fin in a storage unit in Panama. Following an online pandemic-era screening of Inside Downtown in conjunction with Havana Glasgow Film Festival, Egusquiza sent the tapes of Inside Downtown and El Fin pero no se fin to me in Scotland without knowing if there was any readable material contained within them. So you can see there's the tapes on my kitchen table during the pandemic. So these tapes would become the Decolonize the Archive project, which was funded in 2022 by the Impact Fund of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. The restoration was carried out with institutional support of Havana Glasgow Film Festival and African Motion, both Scottish festivals, all was done with the support of the ICAIC. The restoration was completed by Cuban-American restorer Anthony Martinez Cuervo with the assistance of Rebecca Gordon, in association with the Vulnerable Media Lab based in Queen's University in Canada, and in close dialogue with both Alfonso and Egusquiza. So when Guillén Landrián was working on Inside Downtown in 1999, he had not completed a filmic work since the early 1970s. In Cuba in the 1970s and 1980s, Guillén Landrián had continued his creative work, but as a painter, which in fact had been his training before he began making films. He had studied at Havana's Academy of Fine Arts, San Alejandro, with René Portocarrero and Promo Loy, and before in Wifere Olam's workshop. Another practice that was crucial to his creative work was poetry, which has been beautifully explored by Julio Ramos in a chapter of the previously mentioned anthology. Poetry was an organizing logic of Guillén Landrián's thoughts. In Inside Downtown is perceived through the mythic figure of Cuban poet Esteban Luis Cárdenas. And I should also add that there's a much anticipated collaborative publication completed by Greta Alfonso and the conceptual artist Yornel Martinez Elias, precisely documenting his personal archive, but also its intermedial nature. And this publication is coming out this year, so keep an eye out for that. It's titled Nicolás Guillén Landrián, Un archivo, cartas, notas, guión, poemas y dibujos. Yet despite this striking movement between forms and media that we see so clearly throughout his life, after Guillén Landrián's expulsion from the ICAIC, painting was in many ways at the center of his creative practice. During this period, he continued painting, generally faces on the streets of Havana, until he went into exile in Miami in 1989. And thus we see this transition in Guillén Landrián's creative process in Inside Downtown, and especially in the documentary's final scene, recorded in the filmmaker's own domestic space that we saw. Right, so seated with his son and his son's girlfriend, Guillén Landrián's paintings leaned against the wall as their conversation alludes to the external space of the corporate city. But before returning to the analysis of his moving image oeuvre, I want to consider some images of Guillén Landrián's artistic work to provide an idea of the creative projects that the filmmaker artist was completing in the intervening period. These paintings are from the private collection of Alfredo Martinez, who was one of his gallerists in the 1990s in Miami. It's an untitled work made between 1993 and 1994 with spray acrylics on supportive sheets, which clearly shows the unusual ways in which Guillén Landrián was creating his paintings in Miami in the 1990s. It also reveals a unique artistic sensibility. The sheets are like domestic dreamscapes. They depict the outside of a house with an interior that remains unrepresented but beckoning. An open door, like the open shutters in the previous slide, gestures towards the house's interior. And the sheets themselves were previously used by Guillén Landrián and Afonso, also a painter, to sleep on. As such, the surface of these works embodies dreamscapes, memory, their shared experience of exile, and their shared creative practices. Like many of the artists in Inside Downtown, life and work came together. The sheet, of course, also refers to the representational space of the canvas, or the more rigid surface of muralism. This plastic work also unites the cinematic and artistic work of the artist. Like a theater curtain or an improvised screen, the centripetal force of the painting and the canvas appropriates the spatial properties, the centrifugal force of the cinema and the screen. Guillén Landrián was very aware of this movement between the canvas and the screen even much earlier in his career. Although painters are not explicitly thematized in his films until Inside Downtown, his cinematic work is arguably pictorial from its beginnings. In the wonderful documentary on the filmmaker by Manuel Zayas, Café con Leche, Guillén Landrián says that his film O Ciel del Doa from 1965 was intended to be like a fresco, representing the life of the inhabitants of the small town therein portrayed. And here you can see a still from the restored version, which was restored in 2022 by Racni Digital Cinema in Madrid. Conversely, nearly 30 years later, in Miami, in another work in Martinez's collection, Guillén Landrián painted the documentary's titular character, O Ciel, and another image of coffee beans inspired by the 1960s era film Coffee Arabica, each on opposite sides of the same stretched canvas in a continuous loop. And both of these films will be screened today in the film program. Inside Downtown unites these two worlds as a cinematic work from the start of its life cycle. The initial screenings of Inside Downtown at Miami-Dade in 2002 were followed that same year by an exhibition of his paintings. Both the screening and the exhibit were organized by Alejandro Rios. In November 2002, at the Miami Tower Theater, the exhibit of Guillén Landrián's paintings included works centered on the faces of those lost in the Twin Towers. In these paintings, the 2001 terrorist attack in New York joined Guillén Landrián's fixation with the silhouette of skyscrapers in Miami, whose maximum expression was inside downtown. The closing and opening of an era, September 11, 2001, divides the completion of Inside Downtown in these two homages to Guillén Landrián's creative work in Miami. If the tensions and politics of the Cold War imbued Guillén Landrián's earlier work and also his dissidence, September 11th is the event that would close his work and legacy. The epical shift is foreshadowed in Inside Downtown, on the one hand in its intention to automobiles, oil, and the expelling forces of capital, and on the other in the feeling of imminent doom that surrounds the apocalyptic landscapes of Miami, especially when the camera gazes up at the imposing skyscrapers of Brickell and Miami's downtown. It's no coincidence that a passenger on the Metromover comments on the presence of vultures that fly over the old courthouse as one of the most recognizable icons of the city center and of its decay. Art historian Robert Storr wrote in relation to the painting September by East German refugee painter Gerhard Richter, here I quote, "September commemorates the events of 9/11 as well as everything that led up to them and everything that has ensued since and might be called a consequence, by holding all in perpetual suspension and irresolvable tension. A similar space of suspension and tension can be found inside downtown as a document of an era and its closure, both in the world that surrounds the filmmaker and the filmmaker's own life. Guillén Landrián would pass just 2 years after its completion. What both painting and cinema share in his work is the very personal nature of his creative project, and the relationship that both practices have with his vital impulse, the way in which his vital energies were channeled towards his creative work, It should come as no surprise that Guillén Landrián suffered a heart attack in the days after September 11th, embodying the rupture. In many ways, he had the feeling of being disappeared, missing in Miami. He felt as if he was being erased as a filmmaker and artist due to the lack of visibility of his work, which in his mind was intertwined with his sense of being or his sense of self. This connection between his film creation and his sense of self was so deeply bound that he stated that through Inside Downtown he wanted to prove to himself that he could still make films, but also to show that he was still alive. Cuban filmmaker Ernesto Deranas, who directed key works such as Conducta, Behavior, and Los Dioses Rotos, completed a documentary called Landrián in 2023, which was produced by the ICAIC and Alta Films, about the restoration process of the cinematic works by Guillén Landrián. Premiered at the Venice International Film Festival in the Classics section, programmed by Federico Gironi, the documentary screened to a full house. One of Landrián's most moving scenes revolves around the character Osiel Romero, the subject of Guillén Landrián's 1965 documentary of the same name. Still alive, Romero is the same character portrayed from memory in his painting From Exile in Miami. The negative of Osiel de Dor has not yet been found in the ICAIC vaults. The version restored in a laboratory in Madrid is derived from a 35mm copy. In the scene from Landrián, Osiel views the film Osiel de Dor in the process of restoration in a screening room at the ICAIC alongside the director of photography, Leviel Delgado. Delgado collaborated in several documentaries with Guillén Landrián, including El Morro, In Old Neighborhood, Return to Baracoa, and Reportage. We see Delgado and Romero in the screening room. Their voices become a voiceover narration of the restored version of the film. In Guillén Landrián's Osiel de Dor, Romero never speaks to the camera, and his last name is never mentioned, thereby giving him an allegorical quality. In Deranas' Landrián seeing himself on the screen at 16, Romero laughs and says, "It's me, without the wrinkles." Delgado responds, "It's not just the wrinkles. You no longer have an innocent expression." Wrinkles and scars are a daily manifestation of historical time. If cinema is a medium and a narrative machine where time is visualized, the restoration of Guillén Landrián's documentaries made at the ICAIC allows viewers to return to another time and to a past. But within the premises of the same institution that many years before had expelled him, the dialogue in the scene with Romero and Deranas' documentary also postulates the impossibility of that same return. Innocence has been lost. In Landrián, there is no space for a redemptive reversal, nor a rebirth to appear to the narrative codes of melodrama as a descriptive language, but also as a temporal model. The viewer is denied catharsis. The digital degradation of Inside Downtown intertwines with the fate of Guillén Landrián's previous films, but it also inverts its logic. Compared to earlier copies in circulation, the sharpness of the Betacam, which was used as the basis of the Inside Downtown restoration, is poignantly seen in the close-ups and extreme close-ups of Inside Downtown. These portraits were one of Guillén Landrián's cinematic signatures, which Dean Luis Reyes and Luisa Marisi have eloquently explored in the critical work. The subjects portrayed in Inside Downtown are perceived as digitally modeled with a new relief. For the first time, I was able to perceive the texture of Esteban Luis Cardenas' skin, the cracks, folds, scars on his forehead, the wounds of exile, concentrated while reading aloud from his collection of poems, La Ciudad Mágica, the Magic City. Or the blue of the eyes of the painter Enrique Guy Garcia. It's worth mentioning that the restorer Anthony Martinez used the shadows around the eyes of the different characters to calibrate the restoration's chromatic palette. If the restoration of Osiel de Dor dusts off filmic temporality in search of a lost youth, here in Inside Downtown, the restoration instead reveals life histories that sediment, deposit, and accumulate. On the Betacam, which was dormant for 2 decades, There was one image in particular that I would like to draw attention to, an image that we might call interrupted by a glitch. That is the figure of Guillén Landrián himself in a key moment at the end of Inside Downtown. His image in this medium shot is distorted by green artifacts. In the words of the technician who reviewed it, the segment of the tape in question was wrinkled. This glitch, which lasts only a few seconds, was one of the most complicated facets of the digital restoration. As an imperfect, in retrospect, temporary solution, we used a fragment of one of the VHS versions that Alfonso had in her possession since the completion of the work in 2001. In October 2022, Alfonso sent the VHS via a friend traveling by plane from Havana to Miami. The tape was subsequently sent to me in Scotland, where I digitized it and shared it digitally with Anthony Martinez of the Vulnerable Media Lab in Canada. And I carried the VHS back with me to Cuba in December 2022, when an initial version of the restored Inside Downtown was screened at the iconic Yara Cinema as part of the historic tribute dedicated to Guillén Landrián at the 43rd International Festival of New Latin American Cinema. Created in Miami, just 90 miles north of Havana, Inside Downtown had to cross not only the Straits of Florida, but also to the Atlantic to be then able to be projected in Havana a little more than 20 years after its creation. The VHS image was wavy to the eye and imperfect. However, the personal nature of its origin was appropriate for the reconstruction of the figure of Guillén Landrián within his last cinematic work. In other words, as time passed, it was somehow necessary for us to confront the sense of loss in the VHS image, the perception of a gap, a lacuna in the ability to reconstruct and conjure the past. To restore carries many meanings. Above all, it carries the impossible weight of an immaculate return to origin. However, it also contains the possibility of repair and points towards personal and collective memory. It is no coincidence that the Latin root of the Spanish word for remember, recordar, is literally to pass through the heart again. If in the Western world, the eyes were historically conceived as the entrance to the mythology of the soul, the heart has been imagined as the center of memory and feeling, embodying a feeling of loss, but also return. In one of the works not yet found in the ICAIC vaults from Havana in 1969, Remember, a beating heart appears represented anatomically and accompanied by an intertitle, False Hearts for Human Beings. A symbol like the heart is derived from a unitary enclosed model of the subject and time, which is increasingly dispersed and fractured. For an artist like Guillén Landrián, whose thought was imbued with diverse intellectual traditions, including Buddhism and Afro-Cuban ritual, its symbolism would have existed at the level of a palimpsest. Even so, it is significant that it is this image of Guillén Landrián, the torso and the site of his anatomical heart, crisscrossed by artifacts, that was lost and recovered. In certain photographs, the order of linear time is transgressed, and the past and its otherness comes into view like a powerful and independent force. There's another work on sheets, dated 1995 from the Miami period, in which a butterfly with a broken wing is represented, a recurring theme in Guillén Landrián's paintings of the time. Once broken, a butterfly's wing will never heal, even if the butterfly manages to survive. In Alfonso's personal photo albums, there's a photographic image of this work, which was featured in a group exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg, Florida. In the photograph, we can see Alfonso and Guillén Landrián standing together with a sheet depicting a butterfly in the background. Posing both facing their left, Alfonso and Guillén Landrián interconnect like the two wings of the painted butterfly, whose shape they duplicate with their bodies as if in mirror reflection. They both dress in red shirts as if they were attempting to harmonize with the red accents of the butterfly's wings. Everything is part of the same scene, orchestrated, posed, intended as a choreography, but disrupted by something unexpected that left them with their gaze off stage, outside the frame. In the photographic image, Guillén Landrián looks at the camera with a pointed look. Alfonso looks askance. It is as if she were looking at someone behind the photographer, or, given the orientation of their bodies, as if they were surprised by multiple photographers at the same time. Might Guillén Landrián have whispered something in Alfonso's ear, resulting in her turning her head to look? Rather than depicting the butterfly as a transformative or expansive being in flight, the butterfly here, particularly its broken wing, points to a sense of the unease of exile. Guillén Landrián's broken wing is an expansive metaphor for diaspora, but it should not be construed as a singular defining image, but rather placed in conversation with other dimensions of Guillén Landrián's diasporic experience. For this very reason, I'd like to bring to our attention another chromatic image deeply marked by vitality, which to my mind intertwines with this first image of the butterfly. The image is a detail from another of Guillén Landrián's paintings from the 1990s in Miami. According to Alfonso, this painting, like the other images here analyzed from Martinez's collection, alludes to places that Guillén Landrián had known as a young man. Laguna de la Leche, or Casilda, the second, a port in Trinidad tightly associated with the sugar industry. These paintings are memory sites. This painting in particular refers to Cuba as the place of origin, but also indexes a specific spatial mobilization of the past. In the words of Pierre Nora, memory sites are mixed, hybrid, mutant, bound intimately with life and death, with time and eternity, enveloped in a Mobius strip of the collective and the individual, the sacred and the profane, the immutable and the mobile. The past condensed within this image is more essential and fundamental for Guillén Landrián than the reflections upon time contained within O Cielo de Doha or Coffee Arabica, even as both the latter cinematic works propose transversal meditations on history and memory that were likewise intensely personal for Guillén Landrián. Without knowing his oeuvre, the artist and critic Jessica Higgins recently wrote in relation to artist cinema that its process of creation incorporates the sequences of the past into a new way of life. The caterpillar in the opaque crust of the pupa dissolves into pure information, an oozing record of its lifelong consumption. Eventually, as we know, this ooze becomes a butterfly. Higgins alludes to the fleshiness of memory, how memory materializes in our bodies, and how the butterfly carries with it imaginal discs of its life as a caterpillar, contained in that primordial fluid. And here, following Higgins, I think we can glimpse in the detail of the relief of Guillén Landrián's impasto and its layers of acrylic and golden yellow, the bubbling possibility of a renewed life for his work. The gap between the animate and the inanimate, the organic and the inorganic, becomes tenuous. Time materializes in condensations of past and future. Daranas' film Landrián is structured from the so-called instruction files of the Cuban state regarding the comments and acts by Guillén Landrián not consistent with the young revolutionary, in the language of the same files. In Daranas' film, these files compiled by the Cuban state serve as a contrast to the creative gestures of Guillén Landrián's life, an imposing counterpoint to the disciplinary force of the state that was exerted on his figure. 2 years ago, when I wrote Alfonso about an image we might use to represent an event in Edinburgh in July 2023, commemorating the 20th anniversary of Guillén Landrián's passing, in which both she and Jorge Urquiza would participate, she sent me several photographs of Guillén Landrián from his time in Miami. This was one of them. In the diaspora, photographs must be seen but also listened to, urges Tina Kempt. Proposing the sonic record as a haptic methodology for Afro-diasporic identities, Kempt allows us to read against the grain of the classifying logic of the state. In the photographic images sent to me by Alfonso, Guillén Landrián is often playful, challenging the camera and the viewer. Each of the images constellates into a photographic microcosm of extreme complexity. I'd like to conclude with this image from around 2001, a snapshot likely taken by Greta Alfonso. Sitting at a table in his home, Guillén Landrián's body leans back in his chair with his hands expressively raised. One of his paintings figures to his left in the background. Guillén Landrián's whole body is overtaken by laughter. Laughter is a bodily vibration of joy, existential rebellion, and survival. It is a permanent symbol of the future. It is transgressive while still deeply innocent. In the weeks following the 2023 Edinburgh homage, Guillén Landrián's collaborator on Inside Downtown, Jorge Urquiza, located what he believed to be the unedited footage of Inside Downtown in six Betacams, which had been stored in Panama since 2007. Ali McCrum at the historic Edinburgh Film House, then shuttered, worked to digitize the footage. Brittle and covered in mold, no image capture was possible on many of the tapes. But all of the missing scenes from the original Betacam, including the key interrupted scene with Guillén Landrián, were intact. The final restored version premiered at the 2024 Miami International Film Festival, programmed by Alejandro Rios, who had originally screened the work in Miami in 2002. Reconstruction happens piece by piece, memory by memory, as we examine in the darkness of the cinema, our personal memories, which then become collective. Maybe the butterfly can fly again, after all. Thank you.
Hopefully some of us can stick around for a few questions for Jessica about these films. I wanted to kick things off with, I guess, the first question, because, I mean, we got to see a kind of an overview of his work, of his oeuvre, let's say. And I think documentary films that kind of cross different registers of the mode of documentary filmmaking, some more in a kind of almost agitprop direction, some more in a observational direction, and then we have it at the end a kind of more something like a video diary or something. So different types of documentary films, but I felt that regardless, there was something that was uniting them all, like a very clear, let's say, filmmaking style in a sense. And for me, all of his films are infused with this real sense for kind of the rhythm of images. I was wondering if you also had that impression, like watching his films, or kind of engaging with his films. There seems to be such a rhythm, like governing all of them.
Yeah, I'd never quite thought of it exactly that way, but it definitely speaks to me, that description. I'd always been, I'd noticed the connection in terms of the use of portraits, right? So that was sort of the line I saw crossing all of these films, but it's definitely true. And that shift in terms of what you described, agitprop versus observational, that shift in style has a lot of times been marked by his incarceration, in which his editing became much more sort of frantic in certain ways. But
can you tell us a little bit more about that whole history?
Yeah, definitely. So Guillén Landrián was incarcerated several times. It had to do, I mean, there were certain disputes. I think these were ideological. Some people sort of suggest that there are also interpersonal issues. So you notice with Kofi Arabica, so that was post-incarceration, and so you do see that more what I just called frantic, but this sort of the use of rapid montage, etc. But that resulted in censoring, because if you notice, there's the scene where there's Fidel with the Beatles' "Fool on the Hill." So that was not taken well. So also resulted in further disciplinary action, etc. But if anyone has any specific questions about that history, I'm happy to speak about it. I mean, also keep in mind he'd been submitted to electroshock therapy as well. So I mean, I think it was his incarceration was sort of a brutal part of his life, and also had various influences on the aesthetics that we see in his creative work.
Are there some questions from the audience about the films we've seen?
Did you like them?
I think Inside Downtown in particular really gives a snapshot of a time and a place. Miami at this particular moment, the kind of early 2000s, which is, I mean, it's interesting that you were saying in your earlier lecture, you know, it wasn't necessarily a film made for posterity with an idea that it would kind of, you know, have this long afterlife. He's working with these very fragile materials, but still it seems to, for me, it seems to gain so much by looking back on it now from, like, you know, a quarter of a century later practically. And we get this kind of historical snapshot of the place. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that a little bit, like this kind of, I mean, this
captured, or
yeah.
I mean, I do feel there's almost a sense of a fossil. Is that kind of what you mean? Yeah, I mean, I do think it was a very particular moment in Miami, and also a very particular moment in his life. It's a complicated time, and you see the marginalization of a lot of those artists. I think in particular of Esteban Luis Cárdenas, the poet. You can see, and it's a shifting Miami. I don't know if anyone has experience with South Florida here, or if this is very foreign and far away. But, you know, it's historically, it's the site of the Cuban exile community, the largest Cuban exile community in the United States. And it was also, I mean, it was changing. There was that historically, it was a very white community. It was a white Cuban elite. Then in the 1980s, starts changing. That's when Cárdenas, for instance, migrated in what was called the Mariel boat lift. But you see this, like, this sense that a lot of the artists that we, you know, that are featured in the work, I mean, they have been sort of shunted aside, working in very precarious conditions. I think, you know, it's fair to say that also includes Guillén Landrián, and you see that slice of his life. I mean, it's a strange contradiction, because I'm thinking about him and, you know, what this captures of his life, because he also had sort of very elite dealings in the art world in Miami. So it's also very selective. There's an imaginative aspect of it. It's a very, you know, you feel less in the urban space. A lot of times you feel people's interiors. So maybe in a sense it's also a document of that, of these people's lives. But yeah. Yeah,
but I mean, you're kind of describing Landrián as someone who's kind of able to cross between different worlds in a sense.
Absolutely.
That he had this kind of elite cultural world, but he was also kind of somehow able to exist in much more marginalized spaces, let's say. Which is, I mean, it's fascinating that he was able to navigate that, those spaces, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, that also, that applies to Cuba, right? He comes from, I mean, a very elite Cuban family, Afro-Cuban family. And his father was, he was an attorney. He advocated for sugar workers in Camagüey. So I think that's also reflected in his family's experience. But
before the revolution, you mean? Or
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Before.
Yeah.
But his uncle, as I mentioned, Nicolás Guillén, who was a very famous poet, I mean, that's also a very interesting aspect of his family's history, because his uncle was very much, you know, a party liner in many ways. You know, sort of a director of one of the cultural institutes under the revolution. But Guillén Landrián had a very conflictive relationship with the revolution, at the same time that he insisted he was still a revolutionary. but was, consistently marginalized from the Cuban National Film Institute, because he wasn't willing to sort of toe the party line.
Yes, Didi, I'll bring the mic over.
Okay. Yes. First of all, so I'm curious because I saw it on the screen. What is your attitude, or what you mean by decolonizing the archive? So, what is your understanding of that term of decolonizing the archive? So, and secondly, since you presented the film, so of course at some point some Cuban artists and intellectuals began migrating from the island to America, to Miami. So and irrespective of whether this filmmaker, his connection to maybe he's Afro-Cuban, so it's similar to maybe the creation, the promotion of the black bourgeoisie, the black middle class in the U.S. during the civil rights struggle. So what I am curious, perhaps it's not, because you did not make this film, you simply presented it. So what your attitude is also in presenting this to the Cuban Revolution in relation with this artist. So
in terms of the second question, how did the Cuban Revolution?
No. In the second question, considering your presentation of this artist, what is your attitude to the Cuban Revolution in relation to this artist? Also, okay, to simplify it, to make it simple, what is your attitude to the Cuban Revolution at the time this artist was living the island?
What was his position?
Your attitude to
my position.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, let me. So I guess maybe I'll start with your first question. I think you're right that the term decolonizing the archive is a very complicated term, and it's can be interpreted in many different ways. I think I see the decolonizing project within the restoration to be, on the one hand, the idea of if you think about what tends to be restored, what tends to find its way into the archive, what tends to survive. It doesn't tend to be films such as Inside Downtown for many reasons, for the sort of extra institutional nature of the work, for due to the filmmaker's own positionality, both as an Afro-Cuban filmmaker, even if he was from an elite within Cuba, but also because of his diasporic identity, which in a sense, I think, declassed him. As he crosses the straits, his position within society shifts, right? And working, doing this film, it's sort of, as we were saying, it just almost, it was in storage and without air conditioning. I mean, it was very, very precarious material. It's practically ephemera, right? And so this is a work that in most instances does not make its way into institutions. So in that sense, I think that's where I see the decolonial project. But I think it's something that I continue to feel I want to explore. I think that there's a lot there, and there's a lot more to delve into. With your second question, so I just want to make sure I understood it. I guess, well, maybe to start out answering, I mean, I think Guillén Landrián had a complicated relationship with the revolution, to begin with himself. As I was just saying, I don't think he considered himself a counter-revolutionary, even if he was perhaps considered as such by certain members of the party, right? I think, but I don't think he was willing to sort of have a straightforward ideological relationship with the revolution. And I think you see that especially in Coffee Arábica, in reference to the Afro-Cuban labor right? You see that there's irony there, most certainly. And that's in reaction to, probably some of you know, with Cuba, there was this sort of, with the revolution, there was this announcement that, okay, Cuba is suddenly a raceless society, right? And this is in the 1960s. Because race is synonymous with class, and class has been abolished. And I think, as you know, many intellectuals such as Guillén Landrián had skepticism surrounding that sort of harmonious understanding of race under the revolution. So I guess that's what I see as his position. But I'm also very cautious when sort of he's been positioned very much as a dissident filmmaker by Cuban filmmakers, intellectuals, especially of my generation, right? And I think that's also, it's a very complicated position, especially when you see the range of ideological positions displayed in these shorts that we saw today. I think, for instance, inside Downtown, I think that the critique there is not towards the Cuban government or towards communism or the left, for instance. I think it's very much directed towards capitalism, right? It's a very, very critical film surrounding global capitalism, U.S. capitalism, and you see that left and right in that work. I think for myself, it's not a coincidence that was the film I chose, or the work that I chose to focus my own research on. Because as an American, I think that I was drawn to the ability to look in the mirror with that work. It's the one work in which Guillén Landrián is facing U.S. capitalism, right? So I think I was very much drawn to that. I think we need to think about the position both from, regarding Cuba itself, with the same complexity that Guillén Landrián was approaching it with. I don't personally want to approach it in a black and white fashion.
Yeah, I understand, because I asked the question because in my younger days, at some point we were banned from the Russian Cultural Center, even though we identified as Marxists. They called us Trotskyists. We called them Stalinists. But we insisted that in a conflict between the USA and the USSR, we will support the USSR not because we support the Stalinist regime. We will support the USSR because of the planned economy and because it will be a blow against capitalism. So when we present also films by dissident artists who have left, who, for instance, in this instance, have left Cuba, when we present these films by the dissident artists, I ask this question because of in what context do we present it? Do we present it as a film that is against the gains of the revolution that is presented because they are now living in Florida, in USA? Do we present it as, oh yeah, this is artists, these are intellectuals who have left what you are supporting because the revolution is tyrannical, that there's nothing positive that has come out of the revolution? So this is why I asked this question from the point of view, why did you choose this film? What is your attitude to, are you presenting this film as, oh, this is actually a proper positive critique of the Cuban revolution? So this was why I asked that second question, but yes.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Also, thinking about the electroshock treatment that he received in Cuba, in the U.S. that was also routine at the same time. So I think we can sort of point towards one political system, and that flattens the question. Yeah.
I maybe wanted to ask, because we were talking about it a bit before the screening, just kind of upstairs, about attitudes towards his work in Cuba today, because there does seem to at least be more interest in his work, more kind of official favor being given to his work, perhaps, that, even though he once was a dissident figure, he's like, the ICAIC is now involved in restoring his films, so there's a more kind of positive reception of his work in Cuba now, in your view? Or?
Yes. No, I mean, absolutely. Well, as I briefly mentioned, I mean, there was basically starting in the early 2000s, there were some screening. There were also some screenings in the 90s earlier in Europe, but there were some screenings that sort of exposed a new generation of younger filmmakers, critics to his work. But it took really, really long time for his work to get restored, which is also sad because a lot of these works continue to degrade in the archives, over those 20-some years. Right. So I think that it's definitely shifted. A lot of that, it was extra institutional. A lot of it occurred in the film school there, among a younger generation. But this was a project, at least in part, by the Cuban National Film Institute. And that, it's complicated because if it's the same institution that once censored him and very much marginalized him within Cuba until he went into exile. It's a very, very important gesture, but I think it's also a very painful gesture because it's the same institution that stopped the circulation of his work. I think hopefully we can think about that as promising change in relation to his figure. But I think maybe the critique you do hear in Cuba today is, okay, so now he's passed. His, many of these works were made in the 60s or the 70s, but what about critiques that are occurring perhaps today that are not being screened? There's a sense he's sort of been, that in that passage of time, that the more institutional sectors are able to approach his work. But there's a certain pain in the need to establish that distance. But I do think it's very, very important that his work is being recognized in Cuba today. And I thought it was very important that Inside Downtown also screens in Havana. I thought that was very significant. That sort of, in a sense, repatriation of the work in exile. Yeah.
Do you know how that film was received in Havana? Like, was there an interesting discussion around it? Because I guess it would give also a kind of a vision of the Cuban exile community in Miami that Cubans in Cuba might not see very often, let's say.
Well,
in official media, at the very least.
Essentially, yeah. I was I was part of a panel that followed the screening, and I was a bit nervous because I was the only one presenting on his work in exile. The reception, though, people were very warm and very curious and excited to see the work and to talk about the work. Did I feel? I didn't feel any sort of discomfort with it. I also felt nervous as an American in that context, and I think that was needless and unnecessary. But I do think, that's a recent shift. I think exile work or diasporic work for a long time simply was not screened in Cuba. So, that's something that we have to thank, Ernesto Deranas, who's the filmmaker who was able to finally do that restoration project. Also Luciano Castillo, the director of the Cuban National Film Institute, who was pivotal in finding a lot of the works. So yeah, I think that's very, very important, that sort of joining of those two communities when there used to be a lot of restrictions on that. Yeah. Absolutely.
Maybe just one little question. Like, what kind of relations did he have with these kind of contemporary peers like Thomas Gutierrez Alea or Santiago Alvarez? I mean, were they supportive of his work, or were there rifts, or what was the kind of I don't know, the dynamics there between filmmakers of that generation and Landrián?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who say that Tomás Gutiérrez Alea was highly influenced by Landrián. For instance, the intro in Memories of Underdevelopment. You can also, I mean, you can see definitely comparisons with Alvarez. You know, you could ask, you know, who's originating that aesthetic, and also the use of montage in Landrián is, I think, arguably more radical than Alvarez's more radical work. He's much more well known, of course. There were a lot of conflicts, though, I think, with some of his peers. I don't know if this has been confirmed, but for instance, Julio Garcia Espinosa it's been suggested that he was key in his censoring. And so, I mean, I think that a lot of those were, they're described as personality conflicts. That's probably an oversimplification for things that are probably more ideological than sometimes we want to admit. So in that screening, the screening of Restored Works and Inside Downtown in Havana, I did notice that Julio Garcia Espinosa's widow was, so I sat with Landrián's widow, and then Espinosa's widow was 2 aisles back. And I thought that was a very interesting recognition after so many years. Yeah.
It's funny that Espinosa was so antagonistic towards him, because it seems like Landrián's films almost exemplify this idea that Espinosa is so famously associated with, of a kind of imperfect cinema, right? That it's kind of like Landrián's actually making those kind of films that Espinosa's text seems to be calling for.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of irony there.
Certainly, yeah. But I think these institutional conflicts, they're sometimes not, well, obviously, many times not straightforward.
Yeah, yeah. Further questions from the audience? Yes. You want to ask me a question, Didi? I'm not the expert.
Since you mentioned the conflict between Espinosa and his concept of imperfect cinema, why should there be conflict between Espinosa and Guillén, that's his name?
Guillén Landrián.
So why do you think there should be, given Espinosa's concept of imperfect cinema, do you think why is there conflict between these two filmmakers? Is it that maybe Espinosa thinks that it's not, that Guillén's film is not so in line with the concept of imperfect cinema? So 2 questions in one, because this also on this topic. I come back again to the idea of decolonizing the archive. So given the idea of thought cinema and imperfect cinema, so even because this term now has become a sort of buzzword, decolonizing the museum, decolonizing the archive. So how possible, of course, given the core concept of thought cinema, do you think it's possible to decolonize the museum or decolonize the archive while structures of colonialism still exist in the world? So when we talk about decolonizing the archive, when structures of colonialism still exist, what do we exactly mean by this? So,
who's that a question for, Didi?
I think it's also just a good point to keep in mind.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Julio Garcia Espinosa, I mean, his argument was kind of essentially saying that, well, we are filmmakers from the third world. We don't have the resources of first world filmmakers, or whether they're in Hollywood or they're in Europe. They have these kind of, resources to be able to make these very beautiful images and so on and so forth. And we can't do that. But what we can do is make a virtue out of necessity and actually develop a totally different set of aesthetic criteria for judging what film, what makes a good film. And that can be like what a kind of, first world standard for cinema would consider to be like imperfect films or kind of amateur films or like just kind of rough films, let's say. But that's precisely the films we should be making. And I feel like Landrián is doing precisely that with his work, right?
I agree. Perhaps more than Espinosa.
More than Espinosa, yeah. That's kind of where I was getting at. That he's kind of he's actually practicing what Espinosa is preaching. And then strangely enough, like probably in the most radical way with Inside Downtown, even though it's 30 years later and it's a totally different political and historical context, but that seems to be almost a supreme crystallization of this idea of an imperfect cinema, right? I mean, the images are on the face of it so ugly. Like if you're thinking of it through the standards of like, well, what makes a beautiful image and so on and so forth, but somehow he extracts like I think a genuine beauty like out of this like degraded kind of like beta cam like video footage. He's finding a kind of I think a deeper level of beauty in many of the images and through his montage and so on and so forth. That I found really engaging, at the very least.
Yeah, and I do think I think you make a good point that it's the one that's the most extra institutional. The other ones were institutional, and he is they're going out with as I mentioned a prosumer camera, right, and filming their surrounding environments.
Yeah. I mean, it's something almost that's almost like outsider art about it. And then of course he's also, the people he's filming are also these kind of total outsiders and these kind of marginalized, like people kind of outcasts from like middle class society in the United States, let's say. So I think there's a really interesting compatibility between kind of form and content in the film as well. But it is getting late, so maybe we can wrap it up there. Once again, big warm thank you to Jessica for really fascinating lecture and discussion, and I think the films, for me at least, were extremely eye-opening. Hopefully they were for you in the audience as well. So thank you very much, Jessica. And we'll be back next week already with, I think, Usha Ayers next week. Yep. Coming to us via Zoom, unfortunately, because she couldn't. Well, the border situation, with the US is not exactly wonderful right now. But we'll accommodate Usha on Zoom and have a discussion with her on that basis. So come back next week for more Black Atlantic cinema.